Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our 7th webinar in the Forestry Solutions series. We've had a great turnout so far. We've had almost 900 viewers on our webinars, and I'm sure this evening is going to be another interesting discussion. I would like to welcome you or introduce you to our chairperson for this evening, Mr. Sean Eustace from the Wicklow Private Woodland Owners Group. Take it away, Sean.
Can you see me? Good evening, everyone.
Yes, go ahead, Sean.
Good evening, everyone, and you're most welcome to this webinar series. I'm Sean Eustace. I'm from the Wicklow Private Forestry Owners Group. It's been a very successful series. Tonight, we're looking at the question of species selections and alternatives. And we have a wonderful panel for you. I'm going to open straight away and hand over to Niall Farrelly from the research arm of Teagasc. So straight over to you, Niall.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the seminar. I'm going to present to you my presentation here on species choice considerations for forestry. And, you know, species choice considerations, especially in the light of a changing climate, increasing the resilience of our forest resource, and deciding on what we plant today will have an impact on its success in the future. So with that in mind, what we can plant in terms of our tree species in Ireland is really governed by what soils we have available. And, looking at the National Soil Survey, which published many county soil bulletins and national bulletins, we can see the distribution of soils throughout Ireland is quite varied. Of course, on the East Coast, people are very familiar with very good land, suitable for tillage, a range of agricultural enterprises. And if you come to the West Coast, you have the impact of climate on the soils, poorer drainage, etc. So in terms of the distribution of the soils across Ireland, you're looking at 55% of the soils in Ireland are well drained, capable of supporting a range of land uses in agriculture. 21% of the soils across Ireland are poorly drained soils called clays. These are, I'll show you a photograph of these in a moment. And we have 23% of the land in peat, blanket peats, basin peats, etc. So look, this has an impact on our species choice, both for the future and in the past, in terms of the species we can deploy, what can we expect to achieve, etc. So it's one of the most fundamental components of tree species selection. If you look at the better type of soils, as I mentioned, we have a range of enterprises that can be practiced on these lands. You've got the very good land for a range of agricultural enterprises, from dairy, tillage, etc. Very well-drained soils. Very few limitations on these soils. There can be fruit and veg production, tillage, even put into dairy, etc. So these are land which is very much at the centre of food production. And of course, if land like this was planted in forestry, you could have a range of diverse species. It would have possibilities for a range of hardwood species, diverse species, etc. So very few limitations on this type of land. The area of glades across Ireland, I think it was said it was 22% of the land area, so it's quite sizable. And again, this would cover surface water glades where you have impeded drainage or perched water tables, owing to the nature and the texture of the soil. The soil is high clay content, and often you will have heard terms like dauby soil or grey soil. Sometimes you can have a plough pan on this, 25-30 centimetres, but generally all the time you'll see a water table present. The water table is either perched or it's coming from a ground table. Very characteristically, these soils will have rushes on them. And the rushes will infest these soils if they're unmanaged. So again, the species choice on these is much more limited. And there are issues in terms of wind blow and stability of trees on these type of soils. In terms of hardwood options, what species or what options do we have? Well, we have a range of hardwood species, or native species including.
Niall, just to interject there, we're not seeing your presentation at the moment.
Oh.
Just to start your screen sharing.
Yeah, hold on a second. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Can you see it now?
Perfect.
Yeah, look, just to give you an idea, I think I'll just quickly, I don't really need to go over the soils element. You probably heard what I said there, just to give people an idea of what the types of the very good soils are and the options for, wide range of species. And then we're into the poor drained soils, options for a more minor range of species and limitations in terms of how long we can grow crops on these soils in terms of the stability, etc. So, we're more challenged by our species selection and the type of management we practice on these poorly drained soils. In terms of species options, we have a range of broadleaf or hardwood species, fewer native species and some introduced species that have done well in Ireland. The oaks, the Quercus species, which, long-lived species, rotations of 120 years, very adaptable for a range of site types, and of course, very climatized to growing in the Irish landscape. And with the Fraxinus excelsior and the elm there, which I've highlighted in red, and that's just giving an illustration that, you have species which, were very, very successful in the past, but now we're suffering from disease, and the future of these is quite uncertain. We have the Betula, which is the birch. We have Alnus, which is alder, and the native Populus tremula, aspen. And then, to a lesser degree, we have tree species which may be more suitable, not for more, maybe more biodiversity purposes. The introduced species, which have mainly naturalized in Ireland, and naturalized means that they self-seed and seed. So they're climatized to the Irish climate. You have your beech, your sycamore, walnut, lime, etc. And Spanish chestnut is one which is a species which has potential options for climate change. It comes from a warmer climate. It tends to do quite well. And again, it's a hardwood, has multiple uses. There is a seed orchard which currently supplies some Spanish chestnuts, which is in operation at the moment. Just to look at the range of broadleaf species there, just a general overview. We'll give you ash, and everybody's familiar with ash, and look, great species, very much fast-growing broadleaf, as such, with rotations possible in 60 years. And of course, we had the Hurley market. So again, a native species that was one of our most productive. And of course, we're all aware of the disease issue in ash. But I suppose the key question is, do we have a replacement? And the type of sites ash maybe have been planted in the past and may have been suitable or marginally suitable for the species. It can be quite demanding. So, a replacement species would most likely require to have the same attributes or the same requirements for nutrients and drainage. In terms of beech, and these are photographs taken in Avondale on a recent visit. Of course, a naturalized species. It's not really widely planted in the afforestation scheme. I actually think it has great potential. Of course, it's a species which is shade tolerant, so it gives us options of underplanting, continuous cover, mixed woodland development, etc. It's quite a nice species. I like it. I love it in the autumn, and it creates these cathedral-like bowls in the forest. Spanish chestnuts, ones which I mentioned. This is a plot in Avondale. It hasn't done particularly well in Avondale. I've seen it on the continent. It does very well in France. And again, it's a species which has been championed for climate change because it prefers warmer sites. So, you're bringing that species sites that are expected to get warmer into the future. So it's a species that gives us options, I suppose, in terms of similar to oak, probably slightly shorter rotations, and it produces a nice timber. Again, oak in Avondale. There's 2 plots of oak in Avondale, and you know, again, people are aware it's a long-term species. The impact of negative selection. So, for example, the material which we see growing in Ireland is a material that wasn't exploited in the deforestation, campaigns of deforestation. So we don't know the genetic quality of it. It's important to conserve that, etc., etc. How will improve silviculture reduce rotation lengths in terms of thinning? Reducing the rotation length in France is possible to 80 or 100 years. And what are the genetic options for a species, a long-lived species like oak, for climate change? You must remember that the oak we put out today would be grown in the Ireland of 2150, etc. So it's an important consideration to make for the species. In terms of the conifer species, and it's an area which I'll be much more familiar, we have very few native species for commercial production. Pinus sylvestris, it suggested that it may be native of some degree. And again, we've relied on introduced species, and the conifer species gives you a central bole, which is basically apically dominant, and you get a roundwood log produced, as you're well aware. It's a variety of species. Certainly the spruces are widely used in Ireland. The larches were widely used and also widely used in mixture. We had the Japanese larch and we had the European larch, and we had hybrids between those. Very, very good species, very good timber quality, but unfortunately it has been subjected to the Phytophthora ramorum disease. Some of the older species that were favoured in Ireland included the silver fir, which has gone out of fashion, which came into some of the plantations around the 1700, the RDS plantings. And then some species which are very successful in the US, such as Douglas fir, Pseudotsuga minzitzii, brilliant species, quite site demanding. Timber quality is fantastic. It's kind of red deal, tiger stripe, has very good structural properties, and grows well on well-drained, shaly soils, the Wicklow areas. A range of species there have done reasonably successful, coming from both Europe, Pacific Northwest in the US, and Japan. Just to give you an idea of some of these species, the Western Red Cedar comes from Pacific Northwest in Washington, Oregon, and it is a species which is shade tolerant, growing quite well in John F. Kennedy Park, actually. You know, it has an average tree volume of nearly a cubic meter. Its yield class is 22, and it's currently growing quite fast. You know, it's producing 27 cubic meters, 27 cubic meters every year. It's actually producing that at the moment. It offers a lot of potential for Irish conditions. It's very acclimatized to the climate. It's shade tolerant, of course. It gives us options for management, for mixtures. The timber is highly prized. It's very durable. And, you know, I'm surprised more of it hasn't been planted. Move on to Western Hemlock. Western Hemlock, again, is a species from the Pacific Northwest. It's done very well at JFK. It's done very well in Avondale. It's quite frost intolerant species. And when you see it planted out in a frosted site, you largely see a lot of forks on it. It's done very well at JFK. Probably more suitable for frost-free areas. Of course, can be used in mixture with Sitka spruce. Produces a very, very clean white timber that has good structural properties. But we're uncertain now whether we're using the right provenance in Ireland at the moment. I move on to Monterey cypress. This is another niche species. It's one of the most productive species. It grows, it's like grass. It grows as long as the conditions are above 5 degrees, keeps on growing. You know, the yield class of this in John F. Kennedy Park is 28. Of course, the species is widely tolerant of sea exposure. In terms of climate change, now what does this mean for tree species selection? Well, look, it means the potential for increased temperatures, which may result in the frequency of damage to our forests increasing, either through wind damage, insect attack, fires, or disease spread. So, you know, the practical implications are there in terms of your risk may be increased. So what can we do as foresters, maybe, and our practitioners? Is there any options available to us to prepare well for climate change? And in terms of looking at the Irish climate is very similar to climates across the globe in terms of we're looking for species or alternative species for future deployment. We have areas across the globe. Again, it's not surprising, we're similar to the UK, Pacific Northwest areas of US, New Zealand, and areas of South America. Climate in Ireland is basically a warm summer and a mild, with the absence of dry periods, which I believe, and people wouldn't be surprised to hear that. That's what has been classified in the past. Climate change may result in the climate getting a little bit drier in certain areas of the country and maybe wetter at seasonal times, especially in the west. May get slightly wetter in the west. So seasonal changes. And areas which have climates similar to what I'm suggesting here are where tree species thrive are, you know, coast redwood, Sequoia sempervirens, and Japan, Cryptomeria japonica. These are much hotter and warmer conditions. So how are these tree species doing in Ireland? Do they have any potential for future forestation or future forestry? Coast redwood does very well in Ireland. Again, it's probably more of a niche species. It's done very well in JFK. I think the yield class is 24. Fantastic stand down there if anybody has the opportunity to have a look at it. Japanese red cedar, another stand in JFK, very similar to what I described in the Western red cedar. Comes from Japan, done quite well here. Very fast growing species initially, and it's great straight poles on it. Has less structural properties of the timber, but more suitable for decorative purposes and very durable. Alternative broadleaf species include, you know, Oriental beech, Southern beech, Notophagus. Wingnut is one, which is Pterocarya. Different species of oak, which are worth looking at, and then hickory. You know, so these are all plots that exist, have been planted out in JFK. Some of them have done well, some of them have been less successful. So in terms of one of the projects, I have the last few slides here now, and I hope I'm not going on for too long, but the last few slides really talk about a couple of projects. Like, are we using the correct provenances in Ireland? So, you know, it's one of the strategies which the French use is to bring their material from a different seed zone and bring it northwards. So they're taking southern seed and bringing it northwards. You know, basically the rule of thumb is take seed from 2 degrees south in latitude and bring it northwards. And this has been proven to, you know, to result in increased yield, etc. And also, when you're growing long-lived species, you know, those trees will likely be growing in the climate where you take the seed from in the future. In terms of Sitka spruce, provenance selection, it's always a hotly debated topic. You know, southern provenances, is no doubt, will grow longer. I've had an experiment here in Ashtown, and some of the provenance from California are growing into November. And, you know, while you see the QCI, or you see the more northerly ones, the Vancouver, stopping in September. So they do grow longer into the growing season, and as a result, they achieve increased growth. I've also put this in, I thought it was quite interesting. This is, you know, when we talk about mixtures and increasing resilience of forestry, we never considered interprovenance mixtures. And this is an interprovenance mixture of QCI and Oregon together. It serves two functions. It serves as a self-thinning mixture where you have the slower provenance growing, and you have the more vigorous provenance, then will go on to produce your sawlog. And also it gives you a bit of an insurance, you know, a bit of genetic diversity. Breeding populations, you know, some of the questions need to be asked. Are they sufficiently genetic diverse? Do we have resistance within those populations? And I mentioned particularly with ash. Do we have resilience traits in those populations? And what's the suitability of material that comes from other seed improvement programs? Is it adapted for Irish conditions, and can we take advantage of that material for use for ourselves? And it may already be adapted. We're bringing in stuff that's adapted to the future conditions. So there's a lot of potential in that. Again, I want to finish up. I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me today. And just last slide there about Californian students, and one of their mindfulness techniques is to go out and hug a tree. So, you know, I'm passionate about trees. I just thought it was a very interesting slide. Finally, I want to acknowledge before I finish up there, the funding agencies, especially Department of Agriculture and Marine, and there's a number of funded projects that people are interested in finding further information, the Genesis, Fit Forest and Adapt Forest projects, and collaborators who I regularly collaborate and make the research possible. So thank you.
Okay. So I'm back again. Right. Thanks, Niall. That was really a fascinating presentation and brought a depth and to the whole question of species selection, which I'd say for anybody listening, there's a lot of new information there and new questions and thoughts about various species, just as has happened in, say, in the sheep industry, where people changed breeds and tried new breeds, and often with great success. So I'm sure there'll be questions on that. Now I'm coming to the next speaker, which is John Kavanagh, a household name to those who were planting trees, especially because of his involvement with the non-so-hardy nurseries. So John, welcome, and over to you.
Long before a farmer gets to plant his first tree, John Kavanagh has been hard at work preparing the seeds that are the first step in any forest enterprise.
We would be looking at ordering the seed for what's for sale this year, for example. We would have been ordering that seed back in 2018 and trying to secure that seed back in 2018. Then when we get the seed, we sow it the following spring, and it's grown on for 3 years in cycle, and then it's lifted for sale.
John is the nursery manager at the Ballymurn site of None So Hardy.
Nursery is about just over 200 acres here on this site. We've another nursery just south of Kavanagh, the Wicklow-Wexford border, of about 300 acres. Overall, we have capacity to produce between 20 and 25 million trees. Kind of about roughly between 30 and 40% of that would be broadleaves, so 5 to 6 million broadleaves, and the rest would be conifers.
He studied forestry in UCD, and a week after graduation in 1990, he started working at None So Hardy, at a time when afforestation was in the very early stages in Ireland.
The Western Package was the original forestry programme. When that started, there was really no nursery culture in Ireland, and at that time a lot of trees were imported by the likes of None So Hardy to get trees in for the afforestation programme, and the nursery business more or less started around that time, along with the rest. So the nursery culture has developed over the last 30 years. We've built up friendships over the years with other nurseries right across Europe and in the UK, and we learn off each other, and that's how it has evolved. We learn, a lot of what we do here is very similar to tillage farming. So the lads here would all come from kind of tillage backgrounds.
Successful tree improvement programs have been developed in the UK and Ireland, where seed is selected from quality trees with the aim of focusing on desirable features, for example, producing high-value timber or good form from the parent tree.
The seed that's been used now is from seed orchards that have been established from those materials, and they're grown for better vigour, better finer branching, and better timber qualities in general. That's what they look for in those tree breeding programs. So pretty much we've been supplying kind of improved material for the last 10 years.
So we're inside in a polytunnel, and we're surrounded by birch trees that are in pots. Can you tell us what this program is here and the seed that you're collecting in here?
Well, this orchard is the first commercial orchard that's come from the Teagasc tree breeding program, and it was common birch was the species that was being used because it's the main birch species planted in Ireland. They selected clones from what they call plus trees or superior trees that had good straight finer branching and good straight growth form, and were growing reasonably faster compared to other trees. So they selected clones from those, and over years they narrowed it down to a certain number of clones. These clones have been grafted and planted here since 2016. The polytunnel, the reason they use polytunnel is that it's an enclosed environment, so there's no external pollen can come in. Because it's an enclosed environment, you can control it, you get better growth. You can use an irrigation system with fertilizer that's distributed through the irrigation system, and they use the fertilizers kind of used for promoting flowering, which will promote seed growth, which is what we're looking for basically. So during the year, you're back with pests and diseases and stuff like that, and then towards the end of the year, around July, August, when the seed starts to ripen, a guy comes in with a ladder, or a couple of guys come in with a ladder and buckets and just collect the seed by hand. It's then dried, and then we send it to be treated, be cleaned and treated, and then we get the seed back the following March, April, and we sow the seed, and that starts our normal production, which would be for birch would be a 2-year cycle.
Nursery work, from seed collection to preparation to planting and then lifting to sorting of the trees for delivery, is labour intensive work.
This is our grading shed. So during the lifting season, the trees are lifted in the field and they're put into boxes that have liners in them, and as they've been brought in, the liners are closed over to keep the roots from drying out. The trees are brought in, and then they're graded. They're either stored ready for grading, or they're graded by people here. They're sorted into different sizes, or if for likes of oak, you might do a certain amount of pruning on them. They're bagged into various sizes, and then they're labelled and they're got ready for dispatch or for sending up to cold store.
The trees arriving for planting will have a label on the bag that can be used to trace the seed right back to its source.
For us, there's an identity number, so we know exactly where that has come from what batch or whatever. Then it'll have the species, like this label here is oak. It'll have the size, this 60 centimeters plus. It'll have the age. There it says the 1U1, which is basically a 2-year-old plant. How many trees are in the bag? It's 100 in the bag. But also, there's what's called the provenance detail. So you'll have your mass, a certain number, which refers back to the seed cert, which will refer right back to the day that seed was collected from the tree or the individual seed orchard, whatever that was collected from. So this is seed that we collected ourselves. It would have been collected back in 2017. So it would have been collected in autumn 2017. It would have been stored and then stratified by us, then grown for 2 years, and then now it's ready for sale. And like you have things on like a plant passport, which is a kind of an EU requirement. You have to have their plant passport on it, and everything basically that's on the seed cert will be referred to on this label. So it's traceable right from the time in 2017 when we collected it in Coolatin. It's right to now, right to when it goes to the site. The likes of hawthorn, when you collect the berries, obviously you have to get the flesh off the berries. Then the seed has to be put into what they call a worm treatment. What a worm treatment is that they're put into a pit mixed with sand and peat, and they're put in a pit outside. It's not warm as such, it's just it's done, say, early summer, so they've the whole summer in a pit, and then at the end of that summer, they're taken out of the pit and they're put into cold storage over winter. And the idea of what you're doing there is you're mimicking nature. So when the seed falls off the tree, it's on the ground, it gets a warm treatment on the ground, and then it gets a winter and it comes up the following spring. But it comes up nature is designed that the seed comes up over a number of years. But what happens with us, what we're trying to do is get as much of the seed germinating at the same time. And that's why we have to kind of give us that special treatment in the pit and then in the fridge. So in the fridge, you're trying to get the seed to split in hawthorn, and like say hazelnut, you're trying to get them to split so that the seedling can emerge more or less all at the same time.
John has been developing contacts with seed collectors around the country who will collect seed from registered stands and then sell that seed on to none so hardy. Some of the seed is sent away for processing, but they have started doing some processing on site.
Some of it we sent over to a company called Forestry in the UK to have the experience of dealing with these minor species, and they're not that far away, but it's just they have the experience. Some of the seed is treated by the National Seed Centre in Ballintemple, Quilcha, and some of the seed we treat ourselves. We have a limited seed treatment capacity here, but we do some of the species here, and it seems to work well. We've learned how to deal with various species, so we get reasonably good results from the bit we do.
Government targets for afforestation are falling way behind in the last number of years, due mainly to issues around licensing. But if they want to plant 8,000 hectares per annum, that requires producing 18.5 million plants. None so hardy currently produce around 19 million, but could up their game to 25 million if required. At the moment, a lot of trees are going to the Scottish market.
We grow trees first and foremost for the Irish market. That's what we have been doing for the last 30 odd years. Yeah. We were fortunate that when the afforestation program in particular was collapsing in Ireland due to lack of licensing, there was an uptake in planting in Scotland. Ironically, it was the McKinnon report over there started their afforestation program out, where unfortunately it hasn't had the same effect here. But the broadleaves, all the broadleaves we're growing, they're still being grown mainly for the Irish market or Northern Ireland. But for the likes of our Sitka, surplus Sitka is going to Scotland. But like first and foremost, we have to aim for the Irish forestation program, because if we get our paperwork in order and if we get our act together and we start looking at planting 8,000 hectares, if the likes of Nursery Culture or Quilty Nurseries or whoever is growing trees don't have the trees in the ground for the previous 3 years, well then there is no planting program.
While John thinks that we've a good mix of species in our woodlands, he also feels that some species are being left to one side when they could offer a lot to our young developing forests.
We should be planting a wider range of species, but we can't. There's no one has time to actually put work into. The work has been done. You know, there's over the years there's been the likes of Western Red Cedar, and these species have been grown, but there's no one planting them now because they haven't the time. They have to. The hamster wheel. They're on it. They just can't stop. They have to keep going, keep going. They have to look at getting a site done, getting a site passed, and on to the next. And unfortunately, that's the situation we're in. And we're not putting enough effort into looking at what species should we be planting. The likes of Teagasc have done quite a good bit of work over the years with the likes of the birch program, and they've been developing, say, an alder tree breeding program, and they've done the sycamore tree breeding program. Like the sycamore tree breeding program, we have an orchard, and that's going to start coming on stream over the next few years. And you'd like to think that people will start using the sycamore a bit more and start availing of this improved, what we hope will be improved. There is trials going in at the moment, and we will give us a shop window to see what exactly these trees will do. And that's what we need to be looking at. What trees are going well, in what sorts of sites, what sort of mixtures are going well, what does well for, even like continuous cover forestry, what goes well there. Things like we should be doing more of things like riparian woodlands or along riverbanks for helping stabilising riverbanks and using that as continuous cover forestry. But even in areas like where they're prone to flooding, it has been shown that trees help absorb water. They're not going to stop floods, but they will help slow down the flow of water.
None so hardy currently employ 85 people over their whole operation, producing 19 million trees per annum, and they are still evolving their operations. This is ground zero for our future forests, and John is meticulous in his planning and forward thinking. And as we grow our forestry culture, this kind of attention to detail needs to happen at all levels, especially when a forester is ordering trees.
It takes a bit more planning, and the likes of these species are species that were, if you're growing them in fields that are a bit damper than others, it takes you like to lift them when the conditions are right.
Conditions are right.
It's just kind of the planning around it needs to kind of it needs to be kind of a two-way conversation.
Absolutely. You're not. It's not Tesco.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, it's not Tesco. Yeah, you're right there.
Thank you very much, John. That was fascinating. And I suppose you raised a lot of questions there, not least about broadening the number of species that we select and plant. And hopefully much more work can be done on that. But also, of course, raised the very important question that you have to plan 2 and 3 and 4 years ahead so as to have the nursery, the planting stock ready for us to produce and to plant now. And big hitches in planting seriously affect yourselves. And so it's wonderful that the nursery industry has been able to survive in this, and that you in fact could diversify and sell into places like Scotland. So well done. Next, I want to introduce Richard Walsh, Forestry Inspector with the Department of Agriculture, Forest and the Marine. And the inspectors, I think anybody who read the McKinnon report saw that the huge respect and trust that was put and encouragement given to inspectors in the McKinnon report. And these are the guys who are going to be working with us as the private foresters, but also with our advisors. So these gentlemen are hugely enthusiastic and great exponents and proponents of forestry. So you're very welcome, Richard, and off you go.
Thanks, Sean. My name is Richard Walsh. I'm a forestry inspector with the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. Today, I'll be giving you a talk on tree species selection in Irish forests. So I'll be providing an overview of tree species on suitable site types and also the deployment of these species. So I suppose I'll provide you with an overview of forestry as it currently stands in Ireland. At the moment, we've approximately 11% forest cover with an additional 4.9% of trees and hedgerows and individual trees. So we can see that forests and trees are hugely important to the Irish landscape. In terms of afforestation, between 1989 and 2021, there was approximately 300,000 hectares of new forests planted. Much of these forests were planted and owned by the current 23,000 forest owners that we have today as well. And of this forestry, there's an annual harvest with a volume of approximately 4 million meters cubed per year produced from these forests. Forests also are beneficial to Ireland's climate goals, sequestering approximately 4 million tons of CO2 equivalents per year. And forests are also very important to the Irish economy, valued at approximately 2.3 billion, while also employing 12,000 people in the forest and roundwood sector and processing sectors. There is also other sustainable benefits of forestry as well, in terms of recreation, with approximately 22 million day visits per year to our forests. So they're hugely beneficial as a public good as well. But this wasn't always the case. Early in the 20th century, our forest resource was less than 1% of the land area. The early objectives of forests focused on increasing the timber supply to reduce the dependency on imports. So to produce our own homegrown resource of timber. So from what we have is a limited number of native species to meet this objective, as Niall outlined earlier. So much of this objective was met through the use of exotic species and introduced species to produce timber. So we do have over 100 years of experience of forestry and tree species selection in Ireland. To provide you with one example, the Avondale Initiative, in 1903, there was little to no information available on what were the best tree species to plant in a forestry programme. So to overcome this, the state purchased Avondale Estate near Rathdrum in County Wicklow and laid down a large number of species trials, in addition to the establishment of a forestry school, which was aimed to train foresters. Between 1905 and 1913, 49 hectares of land were planted with 84 different tree species. Following this, a further 16 species were planted to bring up the total to 100 species in Avondale Estate. The results from this initial trial showed that the conifers outperformed the broadleaves in terms of growth rates. The best performing conifers included Sitka spruce, Corsican pine, Douglas fir, grand fir, Lawson cypress, European larch, Norway spruce, western hemlock, and western red cedar. Many of these species are used in forestry today. In terms of broadleaves, the best performers were beech, hornbeam, pedunculate oak, and sessile oak, as well as Spanish chestnut and sycamore, which showed a lot of promise. this slide is on the afforestation in Ireland between 1922 and 2017, or between 2020. On the left-hand side, what you can see is the annual afforestation. So that's relating to the green and the red bars. And the right-hand side is the cumulative afforested areas. So that's the running total, effectively. So what you can see is from 1922 to the mid-80s, predominantly the new forests were being planted by the public sector. But with the introduction of grants in the mid-80s, what you can see is the private sector took on most of planting the new forests. And that's where we've led to today, with approximately 11% forest cover, equating to 770,000 hectares. So if we look at what species do we currently have in forests in Ireland today, predominantly it's Sitka spruce, which makes up 44.6%, along with Norway spruce, and the other common conifer would be larch species. In terms of broadleaf species, pedunculate oak and sessile oak make up a large proportion, as well as ash and alder species as well. So as you can see, Sitka spruce is one of the most important commercial tree species in Ireland. Many of the species listed on the right-hand side are selected are based on their quality timber that they produce, as well as the relatively fast growth rates on sites as well. Many of these species as well have thrived because they're adapted well to the mild oceanic climate of Ireland. And primarily at the moment, conifers are the primary source of material for the timber sector. So in terms of how our forests composed, what you can see, I suppose the main thing from this graph is that you can see approximately 70% of both public and private sector forests are composed of greater than one species. So you've got a mix of species in a forest rather than just solely one species. So in the past, you might have had Sitka spruce and Japanese larch, or you could have Scots pine and oak, for example, or you could have Sitka spruce mixed with other broadleaves as well. So there are a number of factors that do affect and dictate the species selection or the suitability of species to a site. Three of which are probably the main factors are climate, soil, and site. And these three are interdependent on each other. So over time, in the past and current, at present, climate can affect the development of soil and the suitability of a soil to support a species. In terms of climate, there are a number of factors which can affect local suitability of species, which include temperature, rainfall, frost, or wind on that specific location. As well as that, you've got site effects, which include elevation, exposure, and the aspect of the site. And a number of these are interlinked with each other as well. For example, you're going to get higher wind speeds at higher elevations as well, which may make it unsuitable for a whole host and range of species. As Niall mentioned earlier, the Irish climate is a cool, temperate oceanic climate, which benefits from the moderating effects of the North Atlantic drift. And as well as these climatic site effects, there's physical limitations on sites as well, which can limit the suitability of a species to a site, including the wetness of the site or shallowness of the soil, or steep slopes as well. So in this slide, I'm providing a matrix of a range of different soil types, which is combined with a number of different species as well. So along the top ribbon, you can see it starts with A, B, C, it goes across, and then along the side, you can see it starts with the species and goes down along. If I pick out a number of species here, I suppose what the graph is showing is that your dark green is your optimal. So this is where species are suited to a site, and your red is your unsuitable. So if we take a look at Sitka spruce along the bottom, you can see that it's optimal to moderately suitable on a range of different soil types. And this is also the case with the likes of Western hemlock or Western red cedar and many other conifers that they can do well on a range of different site types and soil types, I should say. Whereas with broadleaves, they can be a bit more limited to the site types that are optimal for their vigorous growth. So two, for example, would be European beech and sycamore, that are more suited to free draining, more fertile sites, soil types such as grey brown podolics or brown earth soils, whereas conifers can grow on a wider range of soil types. So if we look at the forest area by soil type and ownership, I suppose the important thing to look at here would be on the second bar in the chart. You can see an orange and a blue section which indicate groundwater and surface water glaze. So many of these, this wide range of about 40% of sites in the private sector may be quite limited to a number of, or they're open to a wider range of conifer species and maybe to a more limited range of broadleaf species. Whereas if you look at the bottom of this private grant aided bar chart, you can see a dark blue and a red bar, which are indicative of brown podolic and brown earth, so more fertile sites which are likely to be free draining as well. So on these site types or soil types, you can you have a wider range of species to select from. So you could plant more diverse species on these soil types rather than being more limited on others, for example. So there are other considerations when selecting tree species. Some of which might include the objective of developing good timber quality as well as vigorous growth for a species. And then whether to choose a species based on resilience into the future. And I suppose other considerations may be the species and provenance. Are the recommendations for today's climate suitable for future climate conditions? And then there might be other objectives for selecting tree species, which could include silvicultural objectives down the line. So whether a forest is intended to be planted as for CCF, for example, as Robert Windle mentioned last week. And there are other objectives or considerations, multi-purpose forestry, whether the forestry is intended to be used for more recreational purposes or other purposes, and then environmental benefits or water protections that forests provide as well may dictate the species that you might choose. So if they're planted along riparian areas or other biodiverse areas, for example. So in this chart, what I'm displaying is the private afforestation species composition between 2006 and 2020. So you can see there between 2006 and 2010, and between 2010 and 2012, you would have seen the removal of Japanese larch and ash from the planting scheme. Much of this balance would have been taken up by Sitka spruce in the preceding years. But over the last couple of years, what you're starting to see is more diverse species coming into the planting, or more diverse species being planted. So you've got an increase in the proportion of birch being planted as well as other broadleaves, Scots pine and oak as well. So if we take a look at what are currently the species that are in the approved tree species list in terms of conifers, these are for categories 1 to 11. There are 15 different conifer species, and many of these are introduced species, one of which is thought to be native is Scots pine. So, for example, there is a potential here for choosing more diverse species. So if we took a tree, for example, at the bottom, coast redwood, giant redwood, and Japanese cedar, that these species are displaying they're tried and tested effectively in Ireland, that they do produce seed and they're available to produce vigorous growth as well. In terms of broadleaf species, there's 13 different species of broadleaves that are available for afforestation in Ireland. Most of which are native to Ireland as well. And you can see from the provenances that are available or recommended that the first choice for many is a native source of Irish material or Irish seed. And then for the others that may not be native, the first choice is Irish seed as well. So I suppose it provides you with adapted seed to Irish conditions. And many of these species as well are tried and tested in Irish conditions. So that we know they do well. So one, for example, that was introduced is beech, but we can see from, even though it's introduced from Europe, that we know it does well in Irish conditions. So in terms of afforestation, there's financial support provided for both the establishment and maintenance of new forests and woodlands. Set-up grants cover 100% of the total costs. Grants of up to €6,220 are available for the establishment and maintenance of plantations. This top rate relates to GPC 6, 7 and 9. An annual premium of up to €680 per hectare is available depending on the species of trees planted. Under the most popular planting category at the moment, which is GPC 3, the premium rate is €520 per hectare for planted trees greater than 10 hectares. And for forests established under this scheme, under the afforestation scheme, they must meet the required silvicultural standards of the scheme and must be managed in accordance to the principles of sustainable forest management, which is outlined in the Code of Best Practice and the National Forest Standard as well. So I suppose in terms of diverse species and how they could be deployed, so as I outlined there with the and Niall outlined with the likes of Western Hemlock or Western Red Cedar, these could be deployed in the GPC 4 category, which is diverse conifer. For the likes of GPC 5 broadleaf, this could bring in the likes of sycamore or sweet chestnut or Spanish chestnut, for example. GPC 7 would allow you to plant beech as a species. And then GPC 9 and 10 would allow you to plant native species. And these are primarily done in mixture as well. So the likes of scenario 1, 2, and 3, these are on more fertile and free draining soils, which primarily are oak, beech, birch, and holly. And then with the likes of GPC 10, scenario 4 and 5 are on wetter soil types with the likes of alder and oak, and also pioneering birch woodland. So just to finish up, Niall mentioned species mixtures in his slide as well. So I'll just finish up on this slide. So there are a number of different characteristics which are important to the compatibility of species, some of which may include the ease of establishment, tolerance to stall spray, the shade tolerance, which may be highly important, rooting depth, the soil moisture requirements of the species, the soil nutrient requirements of the species, as well as the tolerance to exposure. So on the right-hand side, I'm displaying a compatible conifers mixture. So you've got Sitka spruce, lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, Norway spruce, Scots pine, the larches, Western hemlock, and Western red cedar. So they're not all directly compatible with each other, but you do see species that do occur in their native range. For example, Sitka spruce with Douglas fir, or with Western hemlock or with Western red cedar or lodgepole pine are compatible with each other. And some of the effects of these compatibility may be due to shade tolerance or shade demanding characteristics of an individual species. Of course, mixtures require careful site selection and management to ensure that the desired final crop establishes successfully. Where alternative mixtures are proposed, the Forest Service must be consulted for approval. And there is more information available on recommended species mixtures and planting orientation, which is available in the Forestry Standards Manual that's available on the DAFM website, as well as Coford's Guide to Forest Tree Species Selection and Silviculture in Ireland. So I can provide links to the two of these in the chat, I think, but if not, I'll provide links to Alex and she might be able to circulate them. I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me onto the presentation today, and thanks everybody for listening.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Richard. Interesting and very comprehensive as well. And extraordinary, the range of the number of trees that are available to be planted. But of course, at a practical level and at farm level, very often choices are limited by other factors, such as the damage of deer, elevation, and so forth. But I'm quite sure some of those questions will probably come up in the question and answer session. I now go to our final contributor, who was film Robert Windle. Many of you would have known him while he was a a forest inspector. He's new tasks in the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Marine, and he has put together a video with questions and answering questions. So I hand over now to Robert.
Robert, how are you?
Very well now, Chris. Yourself?
Good, good. Robert, thanks. You were with us last week when we had the webinar on continuous cover forestry, and we had questions coming in. We've had a series of questions, Robert, ongoing throughout the Forestry Solutions series. So thanks very much for coming on, and we'll go through some of the questions. Some are quite specific, Robert.
Yeah.
Others are a bit more general. So I
hope I'll be able to answer them all for you. Anyway,
absolutely. Yeah, it's not mastermind, so you're all right. Robert, under felling license requirements, Japanese larch and ash were specified in reforestation plans. What species are considered equivalent to comply with licenses?
So for Japanese larch, probably hasn't been on it for the nurseries, haven't been grown it for quite a number of years, probably 8 or 10 years at this stage. And, it'd be unusual for people to put in Japanese larch on licenses now. Probably Douglas fir, Norway spruce, you probably won't get the same aesthetics, looks off it like Japanese larch in the winter time. But yeah, probably the equivalent timber-wise would be Scots pine, Douglas fir stuff, and you get good, there's a good market there for fence posts and that kind of stuff for that kind of timber. In regards to ash, any of the native broadleaves, oak usually will grow away on any ground that would grow ash. So I'd favour that,
Okay, good stuff. And this is one, if you can answer this, Robert, you may set up your own consultancy.
Is there a prize even?
During reforestation, if a site is prone to damage by deer and hare, is there any species that are less likely to be eaten by browsers?
Yeah, alder would be less susceptible to browsers, but usually... Well, what you do is either one on the, this is for reforestation, it is?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, is that in your license maybe that you'd put in that you're going to use tree shelters, but maybe instead of planting 2,500 trees per hectare or 3,000 trees per hectare, that you might reduce the stocking and put them at wider space, and put instead what money you save on labor and trees, then you can actually put into putting in deer tubes. So that, you're spending your money, and then the trees have extra protection. They also have a little microclimate, so their actual survival rate is better. And also because of the microclimate, then your tree grows up through the tube faster, so your tree establishes faster. But there is an extra bit of maintenance, one, to keep the tree upright. And then once the tree emerges, then to eventually release it from that deer tube, and also dispose of that deer tube environmentally at a proper waste disposal facility. So they'd be the different options, but also if you were to pick a different species, then in the broadleaves, alder probably would be an option, and it's fast grown then too. Or alternatively, then, if there's deer pressure in the area, maybe go for a species that would not be susceptible to browsing, like Sitka spruce, Norway spruce, the Douglas fir and stuff like that. The deer do like them, so it's like leaving out Mars bars sometimes. If there's plenty of deer around, they'll go for them, they'll be mad for them.
And of course the thing with the tree shelters is they're more likely to catch the wind. That's why you have to keep an eye on them and make sure that they're staked properly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Doesn't blow it over. Yeah. Good stuff. Under a shade tolerant species, Robert, that could be planted under sycamore, and maybe after ash has been cleared from a site. There are sites where you have sycamore and ash, so sycamore spreads a heavy shade. So some shade tolerant species that might work there.
What would probably work there would be Western Red Cedar, and also beech, probably in the broadleaves. There'd be two that I would favour, and I've used them in the past there, where say we had the storm damage recon, and I can remember a site there in Wicklow that somebody larch and Scots pine had blown on alternative lines that were planted with oak. And the oak, some of it flopped over and that kind of stuff, but most of it stood still. But the site got the full recon, and what they done was they underplanted places with beech and western red cedar, and there was a good strike rate. And even though there was intensive deer pressure in the place, they did browse some of the beech, but the western red cedar got away, and that'll come up, and it'll be a secondary crop then through the oak then eventually, you know.
Yeah, and good markets for both those as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Western red cedar be quite favourable for like decking, that kind of stuff. So you know, you've something coming along then afterwards with your oak as your final crop, but you also have something an alternative to it, and it's a bit of hedging your bets too, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Robert, on a question about native woodland conservation scheme after clearfell, what types of sites are suitable for the native woodland conservation scheme after clearfell? So if a site has been clearfelled.
So kind of soils wise, mineral soil will be best. You know, keep off the peats and that, and also then under I think it's 180 meters in the east coast, and then 150 meters on the west coast. They'd be the kind of main constrictions, but also then it has to meet scheme eligibility criteria. So the different criteria set out in the scheme has to be met. So like it'd have to be hydrologically connected to an SAC, stuff like that. But it's all in the scheme document. And if someone was interested in, you know, they'd finished their conifer crop, and then they were thinking of going with a native woodland conservation afterwards, that, you know, contact the registered forester, someone who has past experience of doing native woodland conservations, discuss it with them, or Teagasc. And you know, if they have any further questions, you know, you can contact your local inspector too if you're worried about the eligibility of it, you know.
I guess the thing is, Robert, isn't it, that the forestry inspectors, you're there to help people. You're not there to catch people out.
No, because I always remember I knew a lady who worked in the tax office, and she said to me, "We're here to help you pay your taxes and have things right, and if you're owed money, we'll get it back to you," and that kind of stuff. Same with the inspectors here. We're here to help people with their applications, have them correct. If they have any questions, you know, because you know, you want people to want to apply for the right scheme and what suits their forest and what suits them, their objectives too, you know. So we're here to help.
Yeah, of course. I think it's that thing that maybe goes back to in school when the inspector was coming around, that it put everyone on the Kigera, that's it, yeah. Maybe you need to come up with a new name. We'll get on with the questions. Some examples of compatible mixes. This is a bit technical now, Robert. Can you give examples of transgressive over-yielding in mixed plantations, assuming optimum site conditions?
Transgressive?
Over-yielding in mixed plantations.
God almighty, that's complicated. I don't exactly know what the question is. If it's over-yielding, I presume it's like mixtures with, say, were previously oak had been mixed with Japanese larch and Scots pine, and the Scots pine and Japanese larch or larch were out competing the oak. They were giving it quite a lot of shelter and helped drag it up a bit, but they were out competing it. And you know, we do the woodland improvement scheme, and we've 2 tranches of that to give support to forest owners so that they can tin out the larch and the Scots and improve the actual quality oaks, so remove poor quality oak trees and pick out your potential final crop trees. So we do have schemes. I presume that's what the question is asking, but also kind of silviculture will help the oak, and it'll also give an alternative income to the forest owners, so they're not just waiting on, say, the oak to mature sometime, or even, you know, get a decent firewood crop from the oak as you progress,
as you thin it.
Yeah.
Are there any nurse species, Robert, that go in that can be retained that won't end up dominating the crop species?
Well, you see, you've all sorts of mixtures, like, you know, you've broadleaf conifer mixtures, you've broadleaf and broadleaf mixtures, and then conifer and conifer. So a lot of these, like, say the conifer ones are compatible. Like before, you know, say if you had a crop in check with, say, a spruce crop in check, and if you added, say, some lodgepole pine, they had a bit of a reaction in the soil, and you get a bit of nutrient fixing, a bit of nitrogen fixing, and the lodgepole pine helped bring on the spruce and bring it up. And, you know, you could see it in different crops. I used to work in research and development down in Cork years ago. And, you know, I remember lots of these different experiments that you'd actually see the reaction there, but also you've like, there was other experiments that we worked on that were, say, Japanese larch, and they'd look at the difference in height between Japanese larch mixed with Sitka spruce, or Japanese larch, Douglas fir, and Sitka spruce. They're all compatible species that grow with each other in a mixture. And also kind of you're adding resilience into your forest then for climate, pest and diseases. If you do have a good mixture of species in your crop, and stuff like CCF, if people are going into that you can actually add an underplant to give support for people to add an underplant there. Say if you have a current Sitka spruce crop, that you can add different species to it, and you're adding to the resilience and stuff like that to your crop then too.
Okay. Robert, we're against the clock, but just on that, under continuous, quite a few questions about continuous cover forestry. Species that can sustain an understory within a Sitka spruce plantation.
Yeah, most, because you're only looking for like small areas to come on. You're not looking for a big blanket across your site. So, you know, you'll have the compatible species, so you'll have seed from your seed trees there already, and then you bring in stuff. So Western Red Cedar, Western Hemlock, they'll fit straight in straight away, and also mix through with then some Douglas fir, you know, your alternative Conifer species, but also birch, oak. You just bring in a mix of stuff, and then your site. So certain things, your site will lend itself to certain trees, and certain trees will come in as invasives, you know, like birch and that kind of stuff, and they're most suited to your site. And, you know, you grow them on, and, you know, try pick out your winner trees, your best trees, best quality trees, and grow them on and thin the rest of them out. And eventually, over quite a period of time, diversify your species structure of your crop, you know.
Yeah, and getting in those different ones, that naturally then helps with the biodiversity. Once you bring in those other species that do well and compete, the more that, as that mosaic increases, then that also adds towards the biodiversity.
It does. It gives more opportunities to different insects, birds. You know, the more the mosaic kind of works, but also brings in an understory of different plants, ferns, mosses, which bring in more insects, plants, birds. You know, and because then you've got a continuous forest, you've got that continuous, you haven't got, when you clear fell it, then that's just gone, and all them species have to move out, or they're left with no home. Whereas if you've held onto your crop and you're just intermittently thinning it here and there, it's kind of in a nice equilibrium, and everyone's happy in there, living in there.
Yeah, Robert, we lost you there just slightly at the end, but listen, okay. Thanks a million for coming in and answering the questions. The Forestry Solution Series has a few more weeks left. It's been getting great traction, so thanks a million. Great to have you on board for that, Robert.
Not to worry, Chris, and thanks very much for the opportunity to take.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you, Robert, and a special thanks to Chris. I think if you don't have a future in the business you're in, you certainly have it as an interviewer, and I'd imagine also asking some of the hard questions. So the likes of some of our current affairs programs, watch out. Thank you very much indeed. Actually, during this whole process, there has been questions and answer sessions going on concurrently. So people hopefully have been asking questions. Hopefully they've also been given answers as well in real time. But now we're going over to a short period where I'm asking the panelists to switch on their screens and to share and their audios so that we'd have a panel discussion. And now it's open for the floor. I'll expect that Alex, I think, has a number of questions there, but I'll just throw in one that for many people planting forests, especially those who do so in the 45 to 50 or even up to 60 years of age, they would have a very compelling reason to look at the commercial side of forestry and even hope to live to get a number of thinnings and perhaps clear fell from it. But there's also the balance of putting in hardwoods. What would be the recommendation on species selection to meet those two needs, the medium need to clear fell and the long-term need of leaving heritage to the future in hardwoods. Perhaps I'll pop that to Niall Farrelly because he's on the research side of it.
Thanks for choosing me, by the way. Look, it's not an easy question. You need to see what the site is and what the soil conditions are. So, for example, say you had a good bit of land with good soils. You know, your options are wide, shall we say. You know, as Richard said, you've got diverse conifers. You know, you've got your Sitka spruce commercial, which will do very well on these grey brown pozzolic soils. You get very high yields. You'll be able to run longer rotations, CCF, etc. And then you can have a variety of broad hardwood species which would be suitable. Again, depending on what your objective of management, are you looking for mixtures? Mixtures, you know, you have your light demanding species such as your oak, and then your shade tolerant species such as your beech and hornbeam. On more limited sites in the west of Ireland, you know, you're talking about glade soils. I suppose your choices are more limited, and you know, you're into the spruces, and you're possibly into, on some maybe heavier soils, into some of the oaks. Would particularly better drainage. You know, alder, of course, is an option. Birch is an option there as well. But you know, your species choice is limited, and again, you can get fields, certain type of fields, where you might get better type of soils, more managed land and less managed land. You know, the example would be up in the hills in Wicklow, where you might have the lower part of the field, where you might be able to utilise oak, and then up towards maybe some of the reclaimed podsols, you'd be putting in Douglas fir, Sitka spruce, etc. So largely depends on the site type. It's very hard to give you a recommendation about seeing the site type. It's very important for people to take notice of what the soil is. Dig a soil pit, have a look at it. You know, go to these species manuals and the Forest Service guidelines. Have a look at what has done well. If anybody wants to go to Avondale or JFK, they'll see, you know, all of these species which have done well, and they'll see plots of them, so they'll be able to have a look at them themselves.
Thanks very much, Niall. I'll actually ask Alex, because I think Alex has been taking in questions, and we'll take another couple of questions. I'm very conscious that we don't want to run much longer than another 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for Robert and for Chris for recording those Q&A earlier, because those are questions that have been asked over the last couple of weeks and have been coming in after the presentations. Just people have been asking as well about the information in the presentation. So all the webinars are recorded, and they're on the Irish Wood Producers YouTube channel the next day. So if anybody wants to go back over the presentations and get more information, we'll also send out the links that Richard mentioned as well to the publications, and maybe some of the information. We have information on JFK and Avondale that we also circulate to people as well. Just on questions, I suppose, John, what would be the most challenging species to propagate or to plant in the nursery?
Yeah, that varies quite a bit. The likes of the smaller seeded species can be quite difficult to establish, because they're going to be competing with weeds right from the word go. So the likes of birch, when it germinates, it's absolutely tiny, and you know, it takes a while for it to get going. So it really has to have a clean start, and that can be quite challenging. The alder is another one that can be quite challenging at the start, but once you get a clean start, once they can get ahead, these species, they're a bit easier. Douglas fir is one that can be another one that you need to get going. It can be probably more difficult to establish out in the forest, and that's, I think, that Douglas fir, there was a question asked about Douglas fir there as well. We think Douglas fir should be kind of nearly treated like an honorary hardwood, because it is going to take more effort to get it established than, say, the likes of Sitka and likes of Norway. We reckon with the likes of Douglas fir, they need to be kind of lifted and planted reasonably quickly, you know, and planted kind of carefully, rather than like the Sitka, you know, where you get a bit more forgiving.
Yes.
Western red cedar is another one. It's one that's not been planted enough of, I think, but it's hard. It would be difficult to grow in the nursery, but again, it's one that would be hard to establish, and it's one that would, if it was treated carefully, I'm convinced that it would be easier, or would establish better. So it's one that could be looked at in the future.
Those last two are slow to get going, but they do catch up. So they are, once they get going, and we have to look after them, obviously, when we get them out on site as well. Thank you so much, John. And Richard, we had one I think you wanted to answer as well live, which was basically the new forestry program that's going to be coming out. Will the premiums be looked at all to, I suppose, encourage more species diversity, or will they stay much the same, or do you know at this stage?
It's hard to tell at the moment, but the new forestry program is due to be launched in 2023. And during the year, there will be a public consultation process. So it'll provide an opportunity for organisations, landowners or individuals to provide feedback or that to the new forestry program.
Yes, okay. Well, we would advertise those reviews as well, so people do have an opportunity to give their input. And then we have, for Niall, we have a question, a very loaded question, and if we had another hour, it wouldn't be long enough. What species may be impacted by pests and diseases going forward? And I've heard your presentations on this, and it's can you give a list of species that be impacted?
Yeah, that's it's a very interesting question. You know, we're all aware of the Phytophthora morum in Japanese larch.
Yes.
And, you know, the worry it might contagion on towards some of the firs. And we've seen diseases, Phytophthora pluveralis in Scotland on Western hemlock. So look, you know, what's the most vulnerable species? Like, we've had the insects imported. You know, in terms of the oak, etc. It's a difficult question. Everything is vulnerable. Whether we can manage our way out of it is probably a logical step. But I talked about this idea of genetic diversity, and you know, genetic diversity isn't only at a species, interspecies level. You know, it's at a gene level, a genetic level. And you know, you look at Sitka spruce and you look at the diversity in terms of genetic diversity from Alaska. Anybody goes on to JFK, they know what I'm talking about. Alaska down to California, 3,000 kilometers, and potential for some of that material to contain traits that are maybe important. And again, similarly with ash, we, you know, so there's a bit of discovery work to be done. As it kicked off, or I suppose we're in a reasonable position, but you know, vigilance is required. What I would suggest as well is actually, you know, we're a country which suffered with the Plato blight in the past due to the Phytophthora. So, you know, we've discovered a lot of new Phytophthora up around the Lagan Valley. So, you know, Phytophthora to me, because of the climate here in Ireland, and, you know, that waterborne disease. And then, of course, we have a pest. Now, whether the pests would be happy living in Ireland, you know, with our conditions. Somebody said if he got here, he'd pack his bags and fly back again. It's too cold. But people about just to finalise here as well, there has been a pest risk analysis assessment done of Sitka spruce. It's been published. It's quite a useful document. So it highlights a lot of agents for Sitka spruce. Now, there will be one undertaken for oak and for pine in that new Adapt Forest project for all the pine species. So that information will be very, very valuable in terms of horizon scanning for these pests and diseases.
And I suppose, Niall, we can look to Europe as well. Sometimes these pests come marching across our direction, east to west sometimes, so we can kind of keep an eye out on what's happening there too, can we?
Yeah, and look, there's a trade issue here, and look, I'm sure the Forest Service are well aware, and you know, they're doing the utmost at the ports, the inspectors, to keep everything in order. But look, it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that something could escape. You know, there could have been firewood brought in to different. So we all have to. You know, people talk about the citizen science. You know, making people more aware. You know, we used to have the old. I remember being in college where you had to keep this beetle out of Ireland, and you had that open all around the country. And maybe it's time to go back to that again, you know, just making people more aware.
I suppose the key is a bit of diversity so that people don't get hit by, if disease comes in, they don't get hit, their whole plantation doesn't get hit, and they have that diversity, then they're kind of covering themselves as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not going to answer that about the diversity one, because I think there's so many uncertainties within that in terms of the compatibility and all that. So yeah, no, it's an interesting question.
I suppose from tonight, forest owners, I suppose, when they're considering different species, they have to think of their sites, which is a big deal. They also have to think about if there's enough plant stock available, as John has already pointed out as well. And then the final question, which is for Robert, and I've picked the worst question, sorry, is basically, has there been any feasibility studies with the mills on what they might be able to consider taking in down the future, or down the line or in the future, or what adaptations do they have to make to try and take in slightly different timber products if it's denser or if there's variations? Has there been any studies in that at all in the country?
I think now Richard might, because I know he's done a lot of research into minor conifers, he might be better at answering this, but I know a lot of the mills are set up for sawing Sitka spruce, and the smaller sawmills would usually be looking at the kind of minor species for kind of the different projects that they are, timber products, that they usually do, like fence and that kind of stuff. But I don't know whether you want to jump in there, Richard, or anything.
Good swerve, Robert. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, I suppose the larger sawmills have a demand for the likes of Sitka spruce or Norway spruce. They can sell those as white deal, as you commonly see in the hardwares or in suppliers. And then, of course, pine would be your red deal. But I suppose it's probably markets for these minor or more diverse conifers would probably open up as a critical mass would come on stream as well. So it's I suppose it takes some input from forest owners to decide to go with some of these species, as well as the markets to open up to process these species as well.
Take that leap of faith. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you all for all your contributions and your efforts for filming and also for preparing your presentations. It's very much appreciated. I'll hand you back to Sean.
And I reiterate that, and Alex, thanks for stepping in there. I want to thank the panelists, all of them, for their huge input. I want to also thank the Irish Forest Organisation, our own, and Alex in particular for all her work in making this happen, the Society of Irish Foresters and its members for their participation, the Department of Agriculture, Forest and the Marine for its support for this whole webinar series, and finally Kavanagh Media for its part. Look forward to seeing you next week. If you have more questions to ask, please put them in and we'll have them and make an attempt to have them answered. So look forward to seeing you again next week at a new webinar.